Bitte den einen wunderschönen guten Abend heute Abend wieder bei Info-Schall mit Lars Schall und Jens Blecker.
Genau.
Wir haben heute zu Gast den Bill Black und Nomi Prins. Vielleicht erklärst du ganz kurz mit ein paar kurzen Worten, wer die beiden sind, mein lieber Lars.
Ja, das mache ich kurz auf Deutsch und dann gleich nochmal ein bisschen auf Englisch, weil ich denke, wir werden auch englische Zuhörer haben. Also Bill Black zum Beispiel ist uns jetzt zugeschaltet aus Kansas City. Hallo Bill.
Hello.
How are you?
Ein bisschen krank.
Ein bisschen krank. You have Erkältung.
Yeah. Quite a cough.
Yes. And on the other hand, we have Nomi Prins in Los Angeles. Hello, Nomi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Okay, it's great to have you on your on our show. And I will now do a little introduction on both of you in German. And I will start with Nomi. Nomi hat Mathematik und Musik studiert in New York. Arbeitet dann späterhin für Goldman Sachs an der Wall Street. Dort war sie Managing Director. Und späterhin ist sie dann Journalistin geworden. Und wir möchten sehr ihre Seite empfehlen, www.nomiprins.com. Und dort wird man unter anderem auch Informationen bekommen über ihre Artikel, die sie aktuell schreibt und die 3 Bücher, die sie geschrieben hat. Unter anderem It Takes a Pillage. Und dann, wie gesagt, in Kansas City haben wir Bill Black. Der ist dort nämlich Professor für Ökonomie und für Rechtswissenschaften. Bill war früher ein Finanzregulator, da werden wir auch gleich drüber sprechen. Und er hat unter anderem das Buch geschrieben, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Bill, this is actually a quote, isn't it?
It is. It's about our savings and loan crisis, which at the time was described as our worst financial scandal in history, and now it looks like a pimple.
Yes. And do you think that there could be lessons to be there are lessons to be learned from compared from the SNL crisis and what's happening today?
Absolutely, in a whole host of areas, and not just for the United States. Parts of the Irish and the Icelandic crises actually look quite similar to the dynamics that drove the savings and loan crisis. And we used the lessons of the savings and loan crisis in 1990 and 1991 to prevent a crisis in liar's loans and subprime loans when we killed them by regulation, which is actually why many of the entities left the insured institutions and became mortgage bankers.
Yeah, when we talk about similarities, we should address that there's one unsimilarity, and this is jail time for the crooks. Could you tell us a little bit about your successes in this area?
Yeah, the United States secured over 1,000 felony convictions of elite bank officials. These are not the tellers, the small people. These are the big folks in what the FBI calls major cases. And that's the greatest success against elite white-collar crime that any nation has had. In the current crisis, if you look at the institutions that did the non-prime loans that drove the crisis and the securitization and such, there are 0 felony convictions.
Yes.
We did tens of thousands of criminal referrals as regulators. The 2 major agencies that we have data for, the Office of Thrift Supervision, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, did 0 criminal referrals. So you have the 3 Ds going on in both of these crises: deregulation, desupervision, and de facto decriminalization.
Yes. Nomi, today Meta EP, the author of The Black Swan, has published an article on this topic in the Rolling Stone. Why isn't Wall Street in jail? Could you tell us why Wall Street has such a good time related to this jail time issue?
Well, because Wall Street, certainly since the SNL crisis, and even after the 2008 financial crisis, has continued to become a field dominated by fewer and fewer people running fewer and fewer banks. In other words, less banks control more of the financial arena, controlled more of the buildup and the leverage and the deregulation that Bill mentioned leading into this particular financial crisis, controlled more of the communication between Wall Street and Washington during the buildup of the crisis, and then during the worst days when various banks, such as Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, or investment banks, were looking at the possibility of their own bankruptcies, were able to thwart all prior sort of checks and balances on what a bank could receive or bailouts they could receive in these situations, and got the Federal Reserve to change their status in order to gain more access to federal subsidization and bailouts, which also came through the Treasury Department, which came through the FDIC and so forth. So the guys that aren't in jail are not in jail because they basically rigged the game leading into the crisis, rigged it during the crisis, and have benefited after the crisis. And because of that sort of immense power and connections and behind the door communications, were really able to escape scot-free. You can't imagine a situation, for example, where a senior person at J.P. Morgan Chase or at Goldman Sachs is going to investigate the levels that Bill was talking about that went on during the S&L crisis, because Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase, is a Class A director at the New York Federal Reserve, which was the one reserve that got a lot of the money and the subsidization flowing to Wall Street. Former head of Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, was the Treasury Secretary during the initiation of the subsidization process. And so there's so much more of a non-line between what happened in Washington and what happened on Wall Street that you just don't see people going after their friends.
So do you think one major problem in this crisis is the revolving door between Washington and Wall Street?
I mean, I don't know, revolving doors. It's sort of the same building. It's a revolving door in that people are sort of changing job titles, but the connections, I think, between the two areas, the GWs, are a lot closer than they've been, and I would argue they're in the same sort of double area.
Yeah. For the build-up of this crisis, Bill, we should talk a little bit about the FCIC report. Do you think that this revolving door issue was addressed in any way?
Well, there was a guaranteed partisan split by the way that commission was created. We now create these things to be hyper-partisan instead of non-partisan. And all four of the Republicans, for example, had been leading architects of the deregulation. There was no chance that they were going to criticize it. And obviously they didn't. I agree with Nomi that you have now the rise of the systemically dangerous institutions. These are the institutions that the administration is telling us that if a single one of them fails, and there are roughly 20 of them, that it will cause a global crisis. Well, then they won't allow them to fail. So in the old days, this is 1993, the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Akerlof with Paul Romer famously wrote an article with a short title, Looting Bankruptcy for Profit, where the people who controlled the bank would loot it and go bankrupt, and they would walk away rich. Well, in the modern era, if they're systemically dangerous, they don't even go bankrupt, or they do go bankrupt, but they're immediately bailed out secretly by the Fed. To me, the most classic comment, picking up on what Nomi said about, well, who's on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York? Geithner, who was the president, and then, of course, is our Treasury Secretary, was questioned by a member of our House of Representatives, Ron Paul, of all people, and testified, I've never been a regulator. Well, that's true, but you're not supposed to admit it.
Is this arrogance?
That was Mr. Geithner in response to a question from Ron Paul. And
was his answer arrogant, or isn't this typical?
No, it was clueless.
Ah, okay. So he's a maroon.
Yeah. Well, Obstkopf.
Obstkopf, French, a fruit head.
Fruit head.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me know your opinion about the public relations, the current public relations in U.S. about the crisis. You don't think U.S. are drowned now?
Well, Geithner and Summers believe that the response has been brilliant. They are busy claiming left, right, and center that this is the least expensive resolution of a crisis in the history of the world, that the entire crisis was resolved for under $20 billion. It took $150 billion to resolve the savings and loan crisis. And, of course, it completely ignores the fact that they changed the accounting rules so that the banks don't have to recognize the losses, and they buried massive losses in the Fed and in Fannie and Freddie. And I think over time you're going to see more losses transferred to Fannie and Freddie out of the Fed.
Fannie and Freddie are still problems. Is this correct? And overall, the crisis isn't over yet.
Oh, it's not remotely over, and Fannie and Freddie are massively insolvent. And the last thing that came out 2 days ago was a budget estimate in which the administration claimed that the cost of resolving Fannie and Freddie was going to drop by half over the next 20 years. And what they're doing is counting anticipated profits of continuing to run Fannie and Freddie against that existent cost, which is complete nonsense economically. But that's the level of propaganda that the administration is using. And it's being pretty successful in U.S. domestic terms in getting that propaganda repeated uncritically in the major newspapers.
Yeah. Before Jens will ask the next question, Nomi, you think also that the crisis isn't over, and actually you are arguing that we are in a depression?
Well, yeah, the crisis that was started and is now being hid by the banking system in collusion with Washington is that there are assets, as Bill was mentioning, that are sitting on the books of banks, that are sitting in hedge funds, that are sitting in private equity funds, that are sitting on the Fed's balance sheet, that are basically infiltrated throughout the system that aren't being evaluated, that by sort of anti-regulation and by the changing of accounting rules that Bill mentioned are just not being accounted for. And so the way to make a crisis seem like it doesn't exist anymore is to just change all the numbers and feed this information to the press who carries it and talks about how much money we, the United States taxpayers, have made off, for example, the TARP program, which was just a small component, $700 billion component of the entire subsidization of the financial industry, which includes a significant increase in the Fed's balance sheet. There's $1.25 trillion of just basically uncalculatable, because they have no market, asset-backed and mortgage-backed securities or toxic asset securities that the Fed could basically consider to be worth anything they want, because there's no outside to say differently. It's sort of they control the numbers by controlling how they decide to proclaim what those numbers are. And what's beneath that, though, is continued erosion at the individual level, continued erosion into these assets of the prices of homes, a continued increase in foreclosures and defaults and delinquencies, not just in subprime assets, but in prime assets, in everything from credit cards to student loans to anything with debt behind it. And all of these things that have been loans that have been packaged up into assets are sitting beneath assets that are deteriorating, but no one is really talking about their deteriorated value. And that doesn't mean a crisis has gone away. That just means that it's being swept under the carpet, and there's like this big hill of dust under the carpet that anyone with sort of a rational eye can see, but that so the powers that be in Washington and on Wall Street refuse to acknowledge because it's not beneficial to their story.
Okay. My next question is about the U.S. economy. What's your opinion about the next decade? What will be the way of the U.S. economy for the next decade?
This decade.
Yeah,
the problems going forward in this decade?
Yeah.
I think there are multiple problems. We still have problems with in housing, with foreclosures, with defaults, with delinquencies. We have problems with the rising costs, not just in the U.S., but with food and various commodity staples like cotton throughout the world. So what's continuing to happen is there's the inequality in wealth levels, the ability of normal people, most people in the United States or in other countries to make enough money to pay for their basic needs and their basic costs of those needs that continue to rise, continues to sort of shove these individuals into economic hardship and more, while, the top, the sort of the people that invest in the stock market, the banks that run it, et cetera, look very good. So what you have is just a continued gap in the haves and the have-nots, and that's the crisis. It's the next economic crisis, how the decade is going to look. Is there's nothing in the way of that. There's no discussion in Washington. There's no fundamental change in how the economy is run or driven throughout the United States to stop that increase in that gap. So it's really more of the same. Coupled with the fact that there's an illusion going on that the current crisis, or the one that just sort of bubbled up in 2008, has been corrected.
Yeah. Bill, you have to leave us in a few minutes. You will be asked at Dylan Riddigan at MSNBC about the Madoff case once again. Can you tell us about the development?
Yeah, the context is that the bankruptcy trustee has brought aggressive actions against J.P. Morgan and against the principal owners of a New York baseball team, the Mets. And Madoff was recently interviewed for a book that's coming out, and parts of this interview were leaked, in which Madoff said banks, although he didn't say which banks, had to know about his frauds, because what he did, made no sense unless it was fraudulent. And this is in the further context that the bankruptcy trustee has made public some of the internal emails at some of the banks that show that indeed they were concerned that Madoff was running a fraudulent operation. And very much picking up again what Nomi has been saying, this is not new. This has been going on from well before the savings and loan crisis. But famously during Enron, if people recall, Enron was doing a whole series of scams involving what we would now call SIVs, these special purpose investment vehicles. And they all had to be funded through banks. And most of the largest banks in the world helped Enron with that fraud, and the internal documents again showed that they had very strong suspicions that Enron was engaged in fraudulent operations but assisted it. And of course, they had to give back most of that money in those claims in that bankruptcy process, but they were never criminally prosecuted, which is Nomi's point. They're now big enough, no one dares to prosecute these people. And as a result, they went forward into this crisis and they did exactly the same thing. And you can't have a sustainable economy when cheaters prosper and when you can cheat with impunity. And that's what we have now. So I have to run, but I will now put on my other, in addition to teaching economics and law and white-collar criminology and being a former financial regulator, I am a current broken-down Verteidiger, so I'm going to predict success for die Schwarz-Gelben.
Die Schwarz-Gelben. Borussia Dortmund, you think they will become German championship?
Genau.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Bill, are you there?
He's already
running out the door.
Yeah, one moment, please.
No, he has to go now.
Yes, okay, but I only will ask you for a repeat of this session because you have now to give an interview at MSNBC. Can we repeat this?
Maybe together with Marshall Auerbach?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, I will ask Marshall about it. Bye.
Right.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bill. Have a nice day. See you.
Okay.
Thank you, Nomi.
Bye, Bill. Thank you.
Okay, Nomi, you will stay with us half an hour more, but we will do now some music, Jens. Correct?
Yes, right. Bitte sag du den Song an. Ich weiß nicht, was du dem DJ jetzt ins Ohr geflötet hast. Ich hoffe, ich mag ihn auch.
Ja, ich sage jetzt den Titel an. Wir haben uns mal wieder auf Depeche Mode geeinigt. We have Depeche Mode now playing, and the title is Get the Balance Right.
Info-Schall. Sie hören Info-Schall mit Jens Blecker und Lars Schall.
Welcome back to Info-Schall with Jens Blecker and
Lars Schall, and we will talk now with Nomi about commodities, right, Jens?
Yeah, right. Nomi, what's your opinion about the food crisis, which is rising the world now, and the prices? Do you think that will be a fight between the U.S. and the China administration?
Well, I think a lot of the rising prices behind the food crisis is very much about international speculation. There's a lot of increase in the volume of trading that banks are doing in commodities such as cotton, such as sugar, such as coffee. So on one hand, there are some issues of supply and demand, and the official reason that a lot of economists talk about, a lot of mainstream international economists talk of as being behind the rise in commodity prices is that, China's growing and India's growing, and so therefore they are, for example, demanding too many commodities too quickly, and there's just not enough to go to them as quickly, and so that is what is squeezing up the prices. And there's some truth to that, but there's also a tremendous amount of speculation behind the markets, I'll say the futures markets and the options markets, the non-physical markets for these commodities, and that's having a tremendous strain on the prices. Because, for example, if a bank in New York wants to make a profit on just betting that they have the power to place a large bet on the exchanges that trade in sugar futures, not in sugar themselves, but in sort of financial instruments that represent the price of sugar. And they can do this in great bulk because they don't care about what the outcome might be of rising prices on an exchange relative to rising prices of that real commodity, that real sugar, that real cotton, that real coffee, that real rice, that real wheat that translates into individuals throughout the world having to pay greater prices for the basic commodities, the basic foods that they buy. So the main reason out there is not the true reason for a lot of the rise in the prices. However, the pain is felt because of those rising prices, because of the speculation in commodities by individuals throughout the world. And that's not a sustainable situation. That's the kind of situation that makes people rally and protest and uprise. Because if you can't eat and you can't feed your family and you have nothing left to lose, that's when you fight even more. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that as traders and banks and the money funds push prices up on markets that have a real bad, devastating effect on people.
Yeah. Is also the devaluation of the dollar an aspect here?
The devaluation of the dollar is a part of it. It's a part of the same argument that says that it's simply an issue of too much demand for too little supply of all of these commodities. And so if the dollar is weak, the idea is that other countries will be able to buy up or push up the prices of these commodities by more, and then sell back to the United States, for example, which is a large consumer of those products. And if the dollar is weaker, then the level of those prices of those commodities rises for the United States citizens, and that it has repercussions throughout the world. But again, that's more of a background reason for the commodity prices being as high as they are. There's really a global capital speculation going on in the world that allows financial interests to control the prices of real commodities because there are no rules on how they can trade those commodities, not in the United States, not in Europe, not globally. And that's really one of the bigger problems than any one currency is the idea of just accumulation of capital throughout the world that looks for ways to make itself bigger. And, for example, in the United States, when Bill was saying just before he had to go that when we had the Enron crisis and banks were working with energy companies to really push up the price of oil, the price of fuel, the price of energy to citizens, now it's just on a global scale, and it's with food.
Yeah. Since you mentioned the speculation aspect here, what is your opinion on the merger between New York City Stock Exchange and the Frankfurt Börse, the Frankfurt Stock Exchange?
Well, I think that merger is a natural evolution of what has been happening with the global banking system for quite some time. In the late 90s, a lot of the European and U.S. banks merged, and that was before there was more deregulation in the United States itself, which happened in 1999 to allow different kinds of U.S. banks to merge and become bigger. Before that happened, there was a lot of European banks buying or partnering with U.S. banks to become bigger, to become more globally powerful, more globally dominant, and that continued in 2000, 2001. There was a little bit of a global recession in end of 2001 and 2002, and certainly in the United States as well. So it stopped and then it started again. And so the fact that large stock exchanges are merging, that's just really the next step, I think, of that global merging of financial powerhouses. You know, it started with the banks and the investment banks and the insurance companies across the globe, and now it's just moving into exchanges. And it wouldn't be surprising if this merger isn't one of the first of many such mergers across countries in Europe, across Asia, with other aspects of the United States markets, maybe a commodity, maybe it's, for example, the Chicago Board of Trade, which is a commodity trading exchange with a similar such one somewhere else in the world. I think it's just part of a pattern, and it's the next phase in this pattern, looking to consolidate really power from a finance and capital basis.
Nomi, there is a question from the listeners. They ask, you worked for the devils of the financial world. Why you get off?
I think that is a really good question. I get that periodically, most from people when I speak. I did work for those devils. I did leave 10 years ago. I can't apologize for the choice of having been there, but I certainly am sorry that I spent as long as I did in the financial industry. I had a lot of internal questions to myself while I was working, and ultimately those pushed me to not just leave. I mean, many people leave the industry, but to leave and write about it for the past almost decade, to talk about it, to open myself to those questions, which are very fair. So I think I can only use what I learned when I was working inside those institutions. And I began working on Wall Street when I was 19, and I did spend too much time in them. And to use that to hopefully educate and to help turn the tide to be more progressive and to really talk about what went on, because I think most people who have worked or who do work in the international banking industry don't talk about it. And what they know could be very useful if they were to choose to do that to help many, many people. And I'm no better or worse for doing that. It was just my choice to talk about what I discovered and what I was most uncomfortable with before I left.
Yes, and we are very glad that you made this decision and became such a whistleblower. Thank you.
Yeah. One more question. Have you got children?
Sorry?
Have you got children?
No, I do not.
No
I have
children.
2 dogs.
I think there will come a marry request.
You will do the right, and you think you will save a little bit of our future. That's a really, really, really great thing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
Yes. Well, let us switch a little bit the topic, I think, and go to Egypt, because you have written about it in the last days, and this is connected to the commodities markets, I think, in your analysis, right?
I think there's definitely a connection in that. One of the things I believe, in addition to the very real desire from the Egyptian people to have a more representative, less corrupt, less dictatorial government, without Mubarak, and just generally more representative of what they are and what they need, is that they were really being squeezed economically. The amount of people in poverty, for example, the percentage in Egypt was continuing to increase. The amount of people living below the poverty wage per day, the equivalent to $2, was increasing. The unemployment, officially, according to there's a website that the CIA actually puts together. So in terms of that information, whether it's right or wrong, it's consistent somewhat across countries. But it had the Egyptian unemployment rate at around 10%, and we know that that's just really an official estimate. But the unemployment, for example, for the youth, for people graduating the universities there, was approaching 25 to 30%. And so when you have a population that not only has a corrupt regime, but also is looking at very dire economic futures from the standpoint of jobs, and from the commodity standpoint, from food and electricity and general transportation, telecommunication, whatever the prices were for needs and sort of daily usage is going up relative to their ability to make money, that I believe was a catalyst for the timing of the Egyptian uprising. Not that there weren't reasons in terms of wanting democracy, and that's certainly what the United States government talks about, as if they weren't supporting the government as it was for years anyway. But I think that the economic reasons were just as strong, and the timing after the Tunisian uprising started because of an unemployed young man setting himself on fire. And that actually catalyzed, and it wasn't reported too much in the press. I don't know if it was in Germany, but 6 other men who are also unemployed, who are also young, also set themselves alight in protest going into the timing of the uprising in Egypt. And so it wasn't a protest against their leadership, although that was certainly a part of it. It was a protest against their economic conditions. And ultimately, across the world, certainly in Egypt, across the Middle East, across the world, the more the economic conditions are unequal and impossible for more of the population, and particularly, young people who really are coming into the workforce and wanting to pay for their futures in their ways, the more of an issue it's going to be for them, and the more protesting and I think uprising we're going to see. We saw certain aspects of that in Europe, in London, with the youth protest and the unemployment there. In Greece, when we're talking about austerity measures to combat the rising debt that was largely because of an international banking system gone wrong. In Ireland and Iceland and so forth, there's not necessarily uprisings, but there are definitely repercussions from a very unfair banking system and a very unfair way of government supporting the financial systems of companies and markets and not of their citizens.
Nomi, as a former employee of Goldman Sachs, do you want to comment the Trojan horse role of the Goldman Sachs Group in Greece for the IMF?
Well, I think Goldman was working with Greece and other countries doing...
Because of the disaster, the IMF sits now on the table there, correct? And this is what I mean by the Trojan horse role of Goldman Sachs.
Well, yeah, because basically they went in as a private bank, really, a private international bank, and worked with a central bank, with a government bank, to effectively cheat on their evaluations of the health of their country, to basically push their debt off to look like it was happening later, to swap it back later. And one of the things that does, and it's in Greece, it's on our Federal Reserve in the United States, is when you do these evaluations and transactions that are at the hands of a private bank or look like something a private bank would do, there's an artificial look to the statistics you report of your economy, and in the case of Greece, those statistics, that report was used to include them in the EU. But I don't think that Greece is alone. I mean, there's different countries for different reasons, whether it's Portugal now or Spain, Ireland.
Or in Ireland, the bailout there of the IMF and of German banks.
Yes. I think the German banks are certainly a part of the bailing out, but the and the IMF behind that as well. But it's because of problems that were created by the financial systems, by the private financial systems, not just in those countries, but between those countries and international capital. In Ireland's case, there was a tremendous amount of speculation in Irish commercial real estate and real estate, and it doesn't take a lot of speculation to go wrong to leave, as we are seeing country after country, a very big problem behind. And that's where the bailouts come in, because the artificial inflation that these practices and that international capital and products and trading can create, when it leaves, can create a lot of devastation and economic turmoil afterwards, because it was not really real to begin with. And at that point, anyone who was in early, any speculator, any bank, any institution, any fund that was in early and got out, has already made their money, made their profit, and run away. And everyone else is left to deal with the consequences. And, and then you have the result of that is the banks aren't helping the individuals or the citizens of the country because they're trying to survive the bad bets that they were involved in. And that's something that has happened in different ways for different reasons slightly, but in many countries across the globe.
Yeah, and around the globe we have about 600 billion derivatives circling. Do you consider those derivatives as a ticking time bomb? Is this weaponry?
Well, it is. I mean, I think that's only the credit derivatives, or one component of derivatives that are around the world. If you add in, and even if some of them are transparent, but just the fact that there are derivatives behind things like oil and gas, because not only are many of these derivatives bets, they're not. It's not like a lot of the credit derivatives, a lot of what was behind, say, the housing crisis in the United States and the housing problems throughout Europe, for example, they're caused by a lot of things, but derivative involvement made everything worse because it meant that you could bet on things without putting down as much money behind your bet. And that's really the issue of a derivative, is that if there isn't enough money behind your bet, whatever it may be in, and then you have to take that little amount of money somewhere else to go and speculate somewhere else or to pay someone else back or to do something else, it leaves a really big hole. And I think it's a ticking time bomb. Credit derivatives still is, because as we talked about before in this hour and as Bill talked about, the problems aren't over. So on the one hand, you have artificial plugging up of problems that still exist, and those impact credit derivatives, how much something will or will not go bankrupt. But also the commodity types of derivatives are inflating prices throughout the world, and that's causing real impact. And so it's not even a ticking time bomb. It is, but it's going to get a lot worse before it blows up.
Nomi, did you heard of the trend strategic default?
Default on what?
Strategic default. The American people wait for a law that they have to left their houses. They don't pay anything and waiting and buy a cheaper home. Strategic default.
There's certainly there is a small portion, and when the housing crisis started, and more in 2009, there was a lot of talk in the press of people who were just walking away from their homes and just letting them defaulting on their loans and letting them go into foreclosure because it wasn't worth it to stick around and pay for a mortgage when the underlying is lower by 20% or 30% than the value of the house had been when the mortgage was taken out. And so the rational economic thing in those situations, according to those reports, was that people would just, and they did, walk away because there was no way to stick around and pay that. And now it's more of an issue of people who it's not even really, it's not a sort of decision based on whether a house was a good bet or not. It's really a decision as to whether or not people can think that their house will ever be worth what it was when they received it. And if it's not better, when they can't or won't or know that they won't be able to make payments, walk away and sort of give it to the bank.
But this could be a system default. You don't think? They don't pay, they right away. The bubble from the emus in America is a very, very great bubble.
Yeah, and the other aspect is foreclosure gate. Could you address this too?
Well, one of the problems among many in the U.S. housing market is that when loans were being given out in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 and 2006 to people for homes, subprime loans as well as prime loans, other kinds of loans, and then second mortgages and third mortgages or mortgages to allow people to repair their homes or whatever it was. They were really using their homes more than once almost to take out loans, and part of that was due to mortgage brokers and various lenders explaining to people why that was such a great thing to do. And if the explanation didn't work, oftentimes, or what we're discovering is that a lot of the documentation behind mortgages was either forged by the mortgage broker or by the lender from anything from the salaries that those people were making to their other expenses and what they could afford. And then separately, a lot of that documentation kind of disappeared along the way because the way the banking system works, not just here but in European banks as well, is that when mortgages are purchased and collected into a package, into an asset that a bank can then sell and sell and sell, the documentation with that loan might not follow it. And often cases, in order to foreclose on a property, a bank has to be able to find the deed or the title or the ownership statement to that property. And in the course of such a fast-moving frenzy of a housing boom, vis-a-vis the banks in the middle of the last decade, a lot of that paperwork was just lost. So now people are being foreclosed upon, even though banks don't have the legal paperwork to do so. And that's become one of a subset of many problems with the crime in the housing sector here and in the housing and banking sector here.
One more listener question. It's from Frank H. Out of Frankfurt area. How do you prepare yourself to the storm rising up the financial horizon? Buy you gold, silver, naturals, or do you don't see there any uprising storm?
Can you just repeat that?
How do you see the precious metal markets and the price action there?
In the metal market?
The gold and silver market?
Yeah, I think as we've seen, the silver in particular is now at historic highs, and gold is close to that. And I think that's going to, there's going to be moments where those values go up and down, but I think ultimately over the near future they're going to continue to rise because despite attempts by the United States government and some other governments to say that things are behind us in terms of an economic crisis, they're really not. And certainly the dollar, the U.S. dollar, isn't something that should be considered as strengthening over the near future. There's way too much debt in the U.S. system. There's way too much subsidization of a bad banking system. I think at some point, once all the artificial pricing of the finance system and the Fed goes away, if that ever goes away, it's going to be even worse for the dollar. All of that and all of the instability globally, financially, is going to continue to give more of a booster to keep the prices of metals, of gold and silver, of copper up as an alternative to more worthless paper currency.
Yeah, but the financial system, the international, seeks for answers for this question too. Jens, could you address the IMF and world currency issue?
Yeah. There's a strategic paper of the IMF to build a world currency. Do you heard of it, and what's your opinion about? Do you think we need a world currency?
Is a world currency practical?
I think a world currency would actually hurt the more weak economies, the countries with the weaker economies even more. I think that's part of what has been happening in Europe. With countries, what we were talking about before, with Greece versus whether that currency should have been in the EU or not, and what a country has to do to change its economy in order to be part of a collective currency. So there's two sides of the notion of a collective currency. I think one is that it will have some kind of economic strength. So whether it's a European currency, whether it's a Pan-Asian currency, that's something that from one standpoint can be considered to compete against, say, the dollar, which is the world's largest currency right now. But to rope out every country's economy into one global currency, I don't even. There is way too many differences between countries, and so what will wind up happening is some countries would be left off, some countries would be a part of it. There would be more depression to the weaker countries and to the stronger countries, which ultimately doesn't create more stability and global stability, except for the stronger countries. And I just don't think it's particularly practical. There's actually there's a kind of amusing cartoon in the UK Guardian where if you look at IMF and world currency, where there's a guy pointing to a sign that says "New World Currency." It shall be called the Twitter Basically. Anyway, I thought the cartoon is funny anyway. So I don't know that's look it up. I don't know that that's necessarily practical. I do see the IMF is looking for alternatives to the dollar, particularly as the dollar weakens, and because of how the U.S. has mismanaged its own budget, which causes a weakening dollar. But I don't know that a world global currency. I don't see that happening.
What do you think have central banks to gain from such a move?
Well, the idea with central banks is they could allocate reserves out of the dollar. So the idea would be that rather than being dependent on an economy that has a weak currency, and that, I think, and obviously other countries may think, has a strange economic policy that contributes to its own rising debts and its own weakened currency, despite the fact that it's the largest reserve currency, that you can allocate reserves outside of that, so that you're not dependent on that weakening as a nation or as a group of nations. And I think that's the benefit to having that kind of currency. I was on a show a few years ago, actually, out of Japan, where they were talking about a Pan-Asian currency, and that is periodically brought up, and it's continued to be discussed as an alternative to the dollar before the financial crisis of 2008 began. And and it was something that gets brought up and discussed and gets dropped sort of periodically. And the notion is always that it's to be able to not depend on the dollar. And I think it's good for the world not to depend on one currency in such a tremendous way. And I don't think that, the dollar deserves it. But at the same point, it's a delicate exercise to figure out how to create other currencies to be the dominant reserve currency.
Nomi, please let me know your feedback. What's your private opinion about the economic power of the U.S. States of America in the next decade? Do you think they will stay on the same position, or will they left and give up a lot of power to China, possible?
And Russia.
Yeah, Russia.
And Russia. Well, as we know, Russia and China have collaborated recently on their own currencies being used on each other's stock exchange, and that, again, is predominantly to create the ability to not use the dollar for those exchanges, which is a step towards weaning off of an aspect of using the dollar. I think I truly believe that the policies of the United States, particularly because, and in light of what happened with the banking crisis here, it was not a small amount of money that the U.S. government manufactured to prop up its banks. And what has happened throughout Europe is really nothing compared to what the United States did in terms of increasing its debt, in terms of changing its accounting laws, in terms of doing everything it could to put money and create money into a system that was severely flawed, and then to walk away, or to want to walk away and assume that's all been taken care of. And I think that's very irresponsible. I think in some of the meetings, some of the global leaders, like the G20 meetings that happened right after the crisis, 6 months after and 6 months after that, and so forth. In the beginning, after the crisis, there was more discussion and there was more anger towards the banking system in the United States and how it was handled. But I think as time has gone on, it has dissipated, because there's this idea that there's somehow a recovery going on, and so it wasn't as bad, or it isn't as bad as it seems. But I don't think that's true. I think that's kind of a mirage, and that the United States is in a far weaker position economically than it wants to believe from a government standpoint. And I think, therefore, I don't know if it's in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, there's just going to be a continued weakening of that influence. I don't know that the dollar goes away as being the world's reserve currency in 10 years. It might be 15, it might be 20, it might be, it will, these things happen a lot more slowly than I think we considered when we just discuss it, not being in control of all the decisions that are made. But I think that the United States has created its own weakening position.
Yeah. Do you think this applies also to the gold reserve question of the Fed or the Treasury or the American people? And do the American people deserve an answer to the question if the official numbers related to the U.S. gold reserves are really functioning? You know that there was no audit of the gold reserves since the 1950s, since the days of Dwight Eisenhower. Isn't this a little bit, absurd?
I think that, well, the gold reserve issue of the audit is not dissimilar to the issue of an audit for the during the crisis that are on its balance sheet with no meaningful audit from the outside. I think the Fed has for decades and continues to really control the evaluation of its own strength, and how much gold is reserved against any of their positions is just one aspect of that. And we're not on a gold standard, so from their standpoint, it's something that they don't really feel they need to address. And from the American people's standpoint, I think like anywhere else in the world, most people are just trying to get by, with their day-to-day lives. I think there's a very small portion of people who really care whether there's gold behind their dollar or not, as long as they can, buy food and buy gas and have a job or get to a job or look for a job or whatever it might be. So, I mean, I think, I think every so often there's again, it's like the issue of a global currency. Every so often there is more of a focus here, at least in the press here, on gold, and then it sort of dissipates again. Right now we're focused on it.
Yeah.
And of course, you do have China and such, that there are other countries that are talking about or that have been reported as increasing their gold reserves, which is one of the things that have propped up the price of gold. The idea that other central banks are specifically discussing and wanting to have real assets behind their currency.
Do you think that in this regard it would be useful for the German people to get their gold reserves from New York to Frankfurt in physical form?
I think that the Germans, I think any central bank in this global community should be keeping more physical assets behind their currencies. So, I mean, I think that, what China has been doing and what Germany may do, that, that's something that I think that, it's their decision, but I think they probably would. I think they probably will.
Yeah.
So, okay. Nomi, on the 2nd April, there will be the Congress of Independent Media in Germany in Hannover. If you want, I will invite you for that.
Maybe you can talk to them via Skype.
Possibly. Thank you.
Ask the whole visit us. Really?
Yeah. Okay.
We will enjoy it, but if you can visit us, Skype is possible. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. We are now at the end of our show.
Yes. Really nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you.
I hope we can repeat this. And do you want to tell something to our listeners personally? Like walk tall?
Walk tall and carry a big stick. No, I think that to your listeners, and I think in general that as everyone knows, I'm sure, who is tuning into this show, the global economy is obviously complex, and a lot of the messages that banks or governments put out officially aren't necessarily only information that can be found about economic circumstances. And I think everyone who questions everything with respect to the economy and their economic circumstances and strives to look for alternative information so that they can form their own opinions and have their own discussions and have their own voices, I think is important.
Thank you very much for this last word. Yeah, this was Nomi Prins from Los Angeles. You can check her website. That's www.nomiprins.com. You should check it out. Thank you very much, Nomi.
Thanks very, very, very much. It was nice to meet you, and have a nice day.
We will now say goodbye. Jens.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, but keep in the line, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Nomi, you don't answer my request on Skype. I'm very, very fast.
What did you ask me?
Yeah,
I can't work Skype. That's part of the problem. I didn't.
We will give you a course in this, okay? A lesson.
Okay.
Thank you. I do need that.
We will tell you. Okay.
Okay.
And now we will listen
to
to our last song, and this is, like always, but before that, Jens, say goodbye.
Goodbye, and listen our next show.
Yes.
On
this will be
Info-Schall with Jens Blecker and
Lars Schall, who now announces the last song. And this will be, like always, Dean Martin, By the Time I Get to Phoenix.
By the time I get to Phoenix, she'll be...
Ihr hört das Info-Schall-Radio, Jens Blecker und Lars Schall. Wenn Fakten über Politik oder die Wirtschaft anfallen, dann sollten sich die Spiegelleser ab jetzt besser anschnallen. Info-Schall-Radio, Jens Blecker und Lars Schall.